Ms. Fore.
Thank you. Well, building on these two, when I was administrator, we had a food crisis, and it was mostly about food prices. And by that time, we had lost much of our funding for economic growth, which in turn funds agricultural projects and programs. And so we began developing a program for the administration, for the world, that would be based around smallholder farmers and what they could do to increase their livelihoods. And it was an extraordinary time for USAID. We put together this program for food. We were the first country to announce. It was the largest. It was effective. We remembered how to do things. We picked up all of the good ideas that came out of prior administrations, and USAID began to lead, and it began to change the tide on food prices. We also picked up on the good ideas that had happened before on public-private partnerships, and so we endeavored to triple the number of public-private partnerships that we had. I think it's an area we could still do a great deal on, but it allowed us to put much of our private sector to work in the supply chains of all sorts of problems that you have heard from Peter and Andrew. We also really began to get traction on education programs in Africa, on the enormous health programs that we had moving on HIV/AIDS, on malaria, and all of these had begun earlier. It's to Andrew's point about long-term development, but they were exceedingly important. And then we also focused internally on two areas. One is that we would move the center of gravity for our programs to the field. So we began trying to do country-based budgeting, trying to do it across agencies, that we would base our development programs around the country's development programs so that we would be reinforcing their own desires of how to grow and develop their country. And we started the Development Leadership Initiative, a very important staffing program for Foreign Service officers so that there could be more Americans in the field doing these types of work. And with that came our intellectual leadership. So it became a change in how we looked at ourselves, in how other countries looked at us, in how our own Congress looked at us, and what we could deliver as results around the world. So it was a results-based approach to development.
Ms. Fore, perhaps this is a moment to ask about the issue of how AID can support private enterprise and private sector-led growth, given that if we're going to have to double agricultural productivity, a lot of that's going to come from the private sector. And you've been a leader on private enterprise development for a very long time. And so I'd appreciate your views on how AID can contribute to private sector-led growth.
Thank you. Peter makes a very good point about Feed the Future initiative. One of the things that strikes you on the food issues is that it is a solvable problem. And the Green Revolution, I think, really began to bring us to that point. And as you look at it, you realize that there is enough food that is grown in the world if you can just get it to the right place at the right time, and then, of course, at a good price. And that is one of the challenges of development. It's to address problems that are solvable. And the private sector is enormously helpful and powerful in this because they carry so many skills and technologies and ways to move ideas into reality and get them out to the smallest person in a community. And that is a powerful partner to have on your side. And in this, the private sector is everyone from for-profit businesses to nonprofit organizations to academic organizations. And in the partnership on the government side, it is local governments as well as the federal government. And so these public-private partnerships, I think, have an enormous opportunity for the future. When I first came into USAID, I ran the Private Enterprise Bureau. And it was a time in USAID when we were privatizing companies because they were state-owned enterprises and governments had run out of money. This will sound familiar to you. And as a result, they were divesting, and we were looking for broad-based economic growth so that everyone could have a stake in their country's economic future. We also began starting stock markets, and we started partnerships that were addressed for the environment, US-Asia Environmental Partnerships and others that were focused on how partnerships could solve many of the problems of poverty. And it became a quest that lets you think about what's in it for Americans and American citizens. And when you are able to bring back economic benefits to home, you realize that this is not only important for the countries, but it's important for us here. So that the growth in Eastern and Central Europe, the growth that has occurred since that time, 20-some years ago, has brought a great deal of prosperity. And when you look at companies and jobs in America today, so many of them are depending on consumers in the developing world. And it is that economic growth, those public-private partnerships, that have been the most important area. I think it is, back to Andrew's point that he made earlier, it's one of those little-known areas that carries an enormous impact. It's thrifty, you leverage money, and it has great potential at home. It builds peaceful and prosperous societies. So I think the private sector is a natural partner for all government programs.